name's Eleanor.
And my name's Robyn and welcome to another episode of Taking Care.
To begin, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are recording today, the Boon Wurrung and the Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We'd like to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded and this land always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
In this episode of Taking Care, we speak to Melbourne-based artist Lou Hubbard. Lou's practice encompasses assemblage, writing, sculpture, photography and the moving image. She's exhibited many works over the past 2 decades and has pieces in collections all around Australia.
We talked to Lou at the end of 2020, shortly after Melbourne's COVID lockdown lifted. Lou had just opened her solo show at Sarah Scout Presents, titled Operative, and also had a collaborative project with Martina Copley exhibiting at Bus Projects titled Pant and Doorbell Thump Is Once. Please welcome to the show, Lou Hubbard.
Thank you very much, and yeah, it's nice to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So to begin, we'd like to jump into the use of objects in your practice. As conservators, are obviously very interested in materials and objects and what makes them signifiers for the artist and of that intent. A large part of your practice involves deconstructing objects, and central to your practice are processes, to borrow your own words, finding and selecting objects, enacting training regimes, performing operations, mounting a rescue. So can you tell us a bit about the importance of objects and materials in your practice and how you interact with them in your work?
Sure. The understanding that I might communicate right now didn't just happen. It's happened over years of trying to understand why certain objects call me to work with them and call me to find out what has attracted them to me and what is my initial attitude to the emergence of the object as perhaps a form that's ready to be put into a new relationship. So it's the step is firstly something takes my attention. I often don't have to think about it. I could see something in the laneway, or someone might give me something as a gift and I automatically have an emotional response to it, for which I now say, do you mind if I should use this in an artwork? And I don't know necessarily why it has called me, so then I set about a process of trying to understand that. And the accumulation of objects becomes, I guess, part of an ongoing or developing syntax of attitudes. And I find the emergence of my own attitudes, in other words, the mirroring of those attitudes, very kind of self-revealing. And I'm curious about that, and I guess that's, for me, also an untapped potential for me to keep going. And I don't know if I will exhaust that, because I don't know that as people we come to a finite. Obviously there's a finite end at some point in our lives, but actually our potential to develop and respond emotionally and to surprise ourselves is very powerful.
In the visual aesthetic of your work, you kind of make very obvious the way in which that you've broken it down and reconstructed it. So you kind of often use crude and simple methods of joining materials together. It's like that join is really kind of expressive language for you. So there's, for example, I guess in the work with at Bus Projects is the use of kind of visible safety pins, wrapping the ironing boards and the chair in the ironing boards and legs crossed, but also the black Velcro at Sarah Scout. The black Velcro you use on the clear acrylic kind of wrapping around all those ironing boards in undercover. So it's like the processes, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my interpretation, I guess, is the processes and the procedures that you kind of subject the materials to are really important, and that you want to kind of communicate that to the viewer, and it's part of your visual language. So how, I guess the question is, in a roundabout way, how important is kind of communicating and documenting the processes that you subject the materials to, this kind of deconstructing, the cutting, the putting back together? Like, how is that important in documenting and communicating that in your work?
Well, it is very important, and almost in my listening to you, Robyn, tell me back and use that language of cutting and sizing, stitching. Already, that language conveys quite a lot. Because they're regular words, we use them. You know, we're born, we live, we die. We go through things. We go through, our bodies and minds undergo numerous processes just in the course of life. I tend to want to believe that if I can make my processes fairly transparent, then the action of what I do will also help with conveying that language that you just described. And I'm not interested in neatening and tucking. I mean, I've seen surgeons do very bad work. You know, everyone knows, and if they haven't, they know about cases where someone's been left in a fairly untidy state. So, if that's a real life circumstance, why would I be wanting to pretend that that life is anything other? I'm not interested in beauty, but my work isn't really about that. It's more that I need to express my confounded relationships to all sorts of things that I've encountered in my life. And you don't really, everyone does if you wish to confront them. So I don't think I'm special in that regard. But I am finding it very interesting to expunge and espouse those types of observations, but more so the deep feelings associated with those experiences. So going back to the processes, and sometimes I guess processes that accumulate might be born out of deep sorrow or misfortune, but actually when they compound in isolation from other processes, the accumulation is quite fantastic. So the idea that a Velcro might be used to stitch, in itself, it might resonate with, the keyboard of a piano, or, isn't that accumulation quite interesting as a set of scales? Or, the nature of, lateral associations, very powerful for me. It comes really easily. I don't have to be on the shrink's couch to kind of go think of a word. It's very much my modus operandi, and I think I probably need to deposit that somewhere. So art does that for me, writing does it for me, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like what you might begin with an initial response to an object and have an idea to, I'm going to wrap that, and then that process in itself spawns a new, process to carry on with. Yeah, there's a lot of fluidity there.
Yeah, and if I can and it might look relatively simple in the end, but sometimes that process has gone through a lot of paring back and shearing away actions over other actions, and I go, I've better start again with that, because I think I just need the direct, now that when the object or the process really emerges for me, I've got a better idea in a more, conscious state what I might redo. And I'll do it with a different bit, like, you beat egg whites for the first time and you go, that was a mess, and then you get it, and then you do it, and it doesn't mean that you become conscious of the process, but you can do it again with a certain flair. And even though some people would measure, like for example with that acrylic covering over the ironing board that you spoke of, some people would measure and cut, but I loved the idea that I'd cut and maybe end up with a tiny little bit down the end. Like, why? What are the values, in other words, when you're on autopilot, and that's it's a bit like, I measure and cut. I love measuring, but what about the idea that you do something differently and see where that process ends up in an aesthetic that speaks back to you? So some people, I guess, don't ever examine those old habits of how they do anything. The idea that you would hem a garment, but then think one day, well, why hem it when I could just cut it and fray it? And that then creates a new aesthetic, but it also might save some time. You know what I mean? So, and then people go, oh, that's ghastly. I can't stand the idea of a messy looking line. But we're all going to turn to mess at some point. So for me, it's like a life value that stares me down. Okay, so that's I feel the need to. That there's a poetic in that I feel the need to confront in my practice. I guess it really helps me take on what I think is. There's beauty in life, but there's also so much travesty and tragedy. Yeah.
So your works engage with subjective connections, as you've just spoken about, between yourself and objects and the processes that follow on from that. And these are somewhat coded with your personal psychological language and the meaning that you perceive in these processes and objects. You said in your recent interview with Bus Projects, I accept that I'm at the centre of my work and I use making to discover more about myself, that surprise that you were speaking of. So materials are tested and controlled, which is sometimes captured on video, but as you've said, there's perhaps more processes that go into that sort of making and that fluidity of getting to the final product. So how important are these personal connections to the interpretation of your work? In a way, you're sort of a conservator's dream in that you love writing and you love video and you're really into documenting your own relationship with pieces and how that changes over time or how it stays fixed. So this sort of more formal documentation, such as video and writing, surrounding the processes and the objects themselves. How important are those physical, more, I suppose, traditional documentation processes in conveying the personal connections you have with these objects and processes for works into the future?
I suppose the short answer is very important, but it's important, I guess, for a number of reasons. And initially, it's so that I can have a record and look back and see where I have been over time. And so any piece of writing that it might even be an email for a completely different purpose, but in constructing the email, I find a bit of myself escapes into, it's not just a letter to the council. There's a phrase that I might have found myself using that I think, so the other me thinks that's useful, that's possibly useful. So it gets assigned, pulled out and assigned to another document and probably filed. So there's a part of me, I guess, that is the collector of ideas. And, well, not just a part, it's a huge part of what I do, because I actually think the materiality is just the exhaust. That's what's left over from a type of thinking. But and video, the work is a document in itself, and video is a document, and video is also the recording of a performance, and writing is performative as well. So I guess when it comes to keeping notes, it's all a big note in the end. A stand-in for where I've kind of been in my life. So. Partly, when I'm setting about discovering an attitude, I'm sometimes mimicking, or I don't have a license to practice surgery or to fly a plane and so on. But in art, I can actually pretend I can do anything. And so, if I'm butchering a body, it's a bit like, hopefully someone might do that on me one day, probably. But I can actually go through some of the things about the recklessness or the beauty of a transition of care. There's so many aspects to this lived existence that I feel needs to be re-seen through actions. That's for me. And I think it happens in theatre, it happens in music, in the controlling me can pretend to be the authority in all of these areas of experience where I've had to trust and give myself over to the training of others in order for me to be trained. So there's an interesting cycle there, I think.
Definitely. I love that phrase you just used, the beauty of the transition of care. I think that could really enter conservation contemporary theory.
Okay, all right.
Because, that's essentially what we're doing, is trying to maintain and in that transition of care from, you know, an artist and an artwork, and then transition of that into the world where it's going to be for the rest of time, as long as, you know, we're here as a culture and able to understand it. So I guess that's really teasing out what we really want to know is, you know, where are the parameters for maintaining that care in the same way that you treat your objects, you know?
Yeah. Well, I think I might have got a bit, went off to one, I guess, several tangents back then. But so what happens if a work should be acquired? That, to me, is the idea of a sentence being taken out of a conversation, and it doesn't mean that that sentence can't be repeated. Or if it's an object that's in mass supply, I can probably acquire another element of it. It doesn't mean the same work has to be made again, and particularly if it's not a work isn't sold as a series. It just means I'll find another way of dealing with that utterance at a later time, if that utterance needs to come back into course. But if not, then so be it. That sentence sets sail, and I do what I can, and conservators do what they need to do to look after those materials. I mean, I go through a fair bit with video. I mean, I try and hand over video files in a way that allows for the updating of technology and other materials. You know, I'm quite aware of trying to package something up, but I also know that when it goes into the hands of a conservator, you know, a museum or whatever, that they have their own conservation practices. I can't possibly keep up with that for myself. But I'm also aware that there's such a thing particularly through, I guess, European art history, where certain artists' works do fall apart. They fall off the walls, and that, I guess, erosion is also part of, I guess, an attitude to historical value being questioned. Yeah, but you know, at some point it might just be an Anselm Kiefer that has fallen to the floor in its entirety, but there'll be some sort of picture, like the way museums use postcards to stand in for a work. I'm sure over time that work has been documented, and maybe it's good for people to see that. You know, that things perhaps were more relevant at some point and not now. Rather than something be deaccessioned, it's perhaps better to see how time has also dealt a blow on, you know, the survival of certain artworks, just as it does on us.
Definitely. And I think that, you know, it's much more realistic notion of like thinking about materials, because, you know, I guess the whole conservation profession is somewhat predicated on trying to make things last for as long as possible, but in a way you're fighting against the inevitable decaying of all matter. So.
And it depends on the nature of the work, how it was made. So if the intention or a prime performative aspect of the work is that it does degrade, and that's a performance, you know,
keeps going.
And it's part of the actual meaning of the work. By kind of keeping in the static material sense, an unchanging sense, is kind of actually defeating them or going against the meaning of the intention of the work. Because if it's supposed to perform, we're stopping it from behaving and performing and living and breathing, and it's kind of static. So we're kind of imposing a meaning that wasn't there in the first place as well.
You know, you obviously reuse objects throughout your practice, and I guess, as you've mentioned, that's the object continuing to speak to you and continuing to have, you know, meaning to be plumbed, or something ongoing to investigate with it. So, for example, just to bring it to a recent exhibition, the chair with the scissors in it has appeared unwrapped in a previous iteration, just in, I think, 2007, titled Scissor Chair. So, you know, in its new iteration within the Show at Bust projects, it was now wrapped in a sheet, where previously it wasn't. So I suppose just if you could talk to that reuse of objects and how the reiteration of these visual motifs, or changing them slightly, continues within your practice.
I went through a rethinking of that object. Once I had understood that what I was setting about with my contribution to that exhibition with Martina was actually a shrouding and a muting. I did consider not using the scissors, but what I had also understood that I was referring back to a medical position. And I think with the original iteration of the chair, I was stuck, because I had a relationship to that chair as, and its colour, the yellow seat with the orange back, I was having an egg yolk moment. So and I can only eat eggs under certain conditions, and they really need to be quite well cooked. So, and I have a relationship to eggs as eyes, and lots of people do.
Yeah.
So, So I recognised that the first iteration where I put the scissors into the yellow part of the seat was, I think, stabbing the egg. So I was recognising that bar stool for its other material properties, its colour. And also the way that the seat was slightly padded and had that little bit of puffy kind of risen form, not unlike perhaps the cracked fried egg before it's turned over. Anyway, so I felt the scissors should stay in its new iteration and have its medical time, its medical outing. So that's the short answer to where I understood that the syntax or the accumulation of the object was about to have a new sentence.
One of your pieces at Sarah Scout, the use of the which we learnt musselays, the champagne tops, and I guess that's taking it to the other side where that is now performing a role that it was never intended to. And I think that reimagining of that, what most people would think of as trash, you throw it away, and now it's so central and just provokes such joy in realizing what it was.
And it was interesting, reading the materials, because I was trying to spot everything. Because I was like, oh yeah, soccer ball or acrylic sheet. And then I was like, what's a mussel-a? I was looking for a little mussel, an actual. And then I was just like, is there seafood?
Yeah,
in
we
this
were
thing?
process of elimination. What could it be?
So it's kind of interesting. We kind of learnt a new term, which was, there was all these familiar things, and then mussel-a was we have interaction with it, but we've just never known the word for it.
Yeah.
I know, it's just like a muzzle, it's like what you'd find. But no, look, that was, it's not pretension, but when I didn't know what it was. I kept thinking about the cages, so I did actually have to look it up. That wasn't in my language, but I loved finding that out. And I just thought, a part of me might have, during COVID, I didn't have access to the workshop at the school where I teach, etc. But I might not have thought, how am I going to attach that? Because I knew that the curtain rod, actually, that little keeper used a screw, and I thought, well, I'll just screw that in. That would have been a very easy outcome. But what I worked on was a substitution for that kind of technical resolve, and the work had its own other thing going on and probably just didn't quite need that level of execution. However, to me, that was such it's like a little quantum development that has shown me, wow, I really perhaps need to persevere with the handmade in my work, because that's actually what COVID kind of showed me in using cardboard and shrouding. I did need to use, not that I don't use materials to hand, but I did more crafting, I think, than I'm used to. And that use of the mucilage, two of them to hold it on, because and then I just realised the whole thing that, there's kind of the phallic bloody champagne shit that goes on all the time when anyone wins anything. And then I realised that it was the piece de resistance of that work, and that was actually very, very subconscious. The language of it fitted so well for me, and that's me being, you don't have to like the piece or whatever, but it's about me going, it was right after all to do it that way. So that was a lovely surprise. And I guess that's what keeps me kind of going, is that these little things that might seem insignificant, if I now had to write about that work, I would be able to tell that story so that it built to an overall kind of profile of what is really going on in the way perhaps some male doctors present themselves, with all of this self-confidence, including, everything about them is projected, and you just hope that they can do their job as well as they can project, and they can. And I'm not saying they can't. And so it's not a gender thing actually at all. No. It's just a part of the idea that yes, and there's that as well, the crowning part of it. So if I did write, I'd probably write a fairly humorous but serious little kind of bit of prose about that work coming together. So,
in thinking about reiteration of work in maybe a place or a time where you're not able to be there, like what instructions or ways of transmitting, are there any ways that you can transmit those importances?
Yeah, I would be able to talk about the ways that I understand those works relating in one way, but I can also describe them from the way the palette, which again is somewhat serendipitous. It's not planned that way, but I guess because I am on a certain track with objects, maybe they've been brought into relationship because I have acknowledged subconsciously aspects of the palette. A lot of it is coincidental, but it's been, I guess, understood and then allowed to remain in that form because I have acknowledged it. So I think I'd be able to write out lots of notes about the things that I think highlight the work, but that's not to say that a curator might come in and actually see a whole bunch of other things that would show me a different way of understanding that work. So I'm not that controlling. And I need to have this experience for myself and then let it go and just hope, if there's a future for that work, someone else might feel quite determined to bring their own set of understandings to it. And I'd be very open to that.
That's fantastic. I guess that's having that open dialogue with other works, perhaps in a group show or spaces as they're reconfigured and by curators that have, a deep understanding of them.
So space isn't something. Space is another medium, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I guess it's another medium, another material that you're working with. I guess
very significant. Yeah. For me, it is. For others, maybe it's the discrete artwork. But I don't understand that.
Well, any artwork, I guess, if it was in a gallery versus in a public space, in someone's house, in their home. You interact with it differently because the rules of engagement are different as well. So I guess you consider all that stuff when you show your work and it becomes part of your language.
I think it's huge for me.
Yeah.
For that context is massive. Yeah. Yeah. No, also, sometimes when I'm developing works, like in this space where I'm right now and the rest of the house, sometimes a part of the rest of the house has to go with it. So it's a bit like, because that's out of the corner of my eye, that has also somehow created an impact on decisions that I've made about that particular facing down of the object.
So how has, I guess, COVID then, not being able to be in the gallery space, been for you, especially say with at the show at Bus Projects where we haven't had access, they haven't been open, and also you're collaborating as well, so you're kind of working in isolation, doing your parts, I guess, and then also bringing it into a space that you don't have that kind of...
working in isolation to collaborate.
Yes.
Well, I had visited the new bus and spent time at Marini's exhibition. And when I say Marini, because of the cube that existed within that space, I wanted to just walk around that and experience. I wanted that physical experience, but also then when I came to working out the space for a current show, I actually took out as many of the objects. I did as much photoshopping of it as possible to create the blanks, tabula rasa, blank slate, etc. But I on my visit to Bus, before, just when the finishing touches were being put on that site, I had factored in quite a number of things about the walls, what was being left, and particularly that big, what I'm calling the inset in the right-hand side. Like, I think for me, the box just fits in. It's not in there, but it's a definite offset, inset that is an offset for that box. No one has to get that, but for me, it's really important that void space draws those two things together. The windows, just the length of it. There's so many things that I really wanted to... I wanted the work to resonate in that particular site for those conditions. I was so into what the ironing boards had meant to me. I could probably do 10 more ironing board works, because there's... now that I feel quite comfortable with kind of saying what they are, as, like almost exoskeletons or whatever, I can dress them up. I can do almost anything. And I feel being a little bit... I quite like the temptation of being literal as well, as in... the language that I bring, or the acknowledgement through language that I bring to the development of the work, it doesn't really leave me, but I'm so aware that this, not heavy-handedness, but this overlaying a process tends to eradicate, or makes the literalness, I guess, seem somewhat subsumed to the process. So I think COVID, definitely the seriousness of the year and the world on just how extreme none of us thought it could get. It's always been there, but this threat was everywhere on that world stage, and yet we were unable to move. It was very, very difficult, and I guess that has entered the work for both those shows. And I guess I'm sort of still feeling it, and sometimes I guess, as I said kind of much earlier in the discussion, there's something about what you know, and what, for me, I don't want to sort of go under that. I don't want to... I mean, some works are lighter than others for me, but even in the lightness, there's still the essence of something quite serious about what it is to be human and alive in all its fashion.
Well, because it's interesting with, I guess, the recent shows. There's medical kind of imagery. There is these kind of objects that are kind of analogues for bodies. There's there's these kind of very medical kind of language that's really present. And I guess with the pandemic and everything, I think everyone's thinking about health and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of interesting. There's that layer across things, and
the recurring visual motifs from CNN and Fox News through BBC. We all saw the images. We saw people being taken into hospital and coming out the other end in a particular way, and the shrouding. I guess the ironing boards. I saw them in their collapsed state. I saw them. I saw just all of the things that they could be as transporters of bodies as well. So it's not just the body itself; it's the carriage that also is designed in the passage of a body from one place to another, in both in an alive form and in its deceased state. So. And the idea of the shrouding, you can only use black so much, and that can really push back and keep me out of the experience. But the white mixed the medical and just that idea of people keeping their furniture covered for years in sheets. I mean, that seemed more complicated and yet so straightforward, because you're saying it's a sheet, it's a ghost, it's a this. It seemed lighter, but still conveyed the seriousness or the muteness of the occasion, and that occasion remains ill-defined or undefined.
Well, I guess there's also cultural readings of white shroudedness, like Asian cultures. You wear white to a funeral. It's a very... So it's interesting that, I guess...
There's readings, different people.
Different, yes.
Yeah. And I'm not privy to that. So that's and I would then own that. But that's another example of a curator, such as yourself, might actually kind of go, I see this very differently, and I'd be very interested in that.
Yeah, it's great in that space as well, because that whiteness really speaks to the walls, to the floor, to the light coming in, and to the point of you could almost walk past that space and think it was empty until you're in it, and then it's upon you.
Yes, it's like the bones of yeah, and there is a skeletal kind of layout as well. Yeah.
I think we could just keep going forever. I think we better wrap up for... thank you so much for joining us today. We know you're super busy, but this has been really valuable for us.
I've really enjoyed the conversation. You brought up a number of things I perhaps haven't, that been on my mind, but I haven't had to articulate them, and it's good for me to do that.